Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Future Quake Show. I am Dr. Future.
And I am Tom Bionic.
And we have a great show planned for this week with
Yes.
some tremendous guests. I know I tend to say that a lot.
Well, I think in this case, with most things that I appreciate, they tend to get better the farther they go on. And I would like to say that with the Collins brothers, I think we've reached a new sort of a new high of sort of intellectual thought, very clear-headed thinking, but also very succinct.
Well, those are our new guests. He's given you a taste of our guests for this week are going to be Philip and Paul Collins, who are the authors of the book The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship, and also are authors of some of the most challenging information you'll find on the World Wide Web and elsewhere.
Yes.
They're very much in demand in a number of locations with their writing, and we're going to be talking about Dominionism and evangelicalism and the New World Order. And it's going to be a great show. And this first show that we have, we're going to find out a little bit about their very interesting background.
Yeah, they talk quite at length about it, but I think it's important for our listeners to know that. I think it's worthy of the time they spend on it, because they're very schooled, they're very intelligent individuals.
It sets the background stage of what formulated their interest in getting into these incredibly challenging topics that they review with regularity and now are extremely well known for. And it involves professors and the CIA and all this other stuff. I'm not going to steal their thunder, but it's interesting, but it really just sets the groundwork for the rest of the interviews Tuesday through Thursday of this week to hear what they have to share with us. So we're going to take off for that. Do you have any other kind of final comments?
I'm just looking forward to what they're doing.
Yeah. Well, I think you're going to really enjoy it. Again, it's Philip and Paul Collins, who are the authors of the book, The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship. And we're going to go away with that interview, and then we'll be back up with a quick wrap-up on Future Quake. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Dr. Future, and welcome back to the Future Quake Show. Tom and I would like to introduce our guests for this week, Philip and Paul Collins, who are the authors of the book The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship, also extremely well known throughout the blogosphere and throughout the internet with some of their very provocative writings. And we're going to talk today about Dominionism, evangelicalism, and the New World Order. And I just want to welcome both of you, Philip and Paul, to being on the Future Quake Show.
Hey, thank you so much, Dr. Future. Thanks, Doc.
And Tom and I have heard much about you. We know that you've impressed many people who we've had some affiliation with our show. We recently had the Gilberts.
Yeah, we've really enjoyed some of your writings as well.
The Gilberts just love having you on, and of course Tom Horn thinks highly of you. And you're also listed as columnist with Raiders News Update, one of our favorite sources for news. And it's just a real pleasure to have two esteemed individuals such as yourselves on the Future Quake Show. It's something that's really long overdue. To begin our discussion today, could you share with our audience just a little bit about your respective backgrounds and how it led to your current writing activities?
Yeah, that'd be fine. This is Paul, by the way.
All right.
For me, this kind of study into deep politics, into parapolitics, really began back in the early 90s when I was in Colorado, and I ran with a crowd there that was made up of a lot of anti-authoritarians, a lot of anarchists. There was a sizable anarchist crowd in the school population, and cliques were really frowned upon at our school, and everybody was pretty close, so you could pretty much find a lot of overlap between groups, and so I ended up running with a lot of those kids, and there was at this time in Colorado a real healthy suspicion of government, and there was a real individualist mentality, and that was true amongst the youth as it was for the adults. And while a lot of those anarchist kids, I didn't really share their views on how society should be arranged. They did point out a lot of legitimate flaws with modern government, and it's interesting to note that at the time Clinton was president, and he wasn't cut any slack by anybody there, whether it was left or right of center. And so, everybody had a sense that something was not quite right, and that included myself, so I started to read, get my nose into a lot of books that were out there over the topic of deep politics and parapolitics, and But the epiphany came for me around 95. In 95, we relocated from Colorado to Ohio, and I started taking classes at a local community college, and it was there that I met a teacher who would go on to be my teacher in both constitutional law and criminal justice, and he was a judge in the area. And when he wasn't working his court, he was putting in his time educating younger people, young students in the college. That was really what his passion was. And I knew that he had a really interesting background, but I didn't know just how interesting until I was in a class called American Issues, and he started giving a talk in that class. He was an invited speaker at that time. And I had him as a teacher, but he was the invited speaker at this particular class. And he basically went into how he had been a CIA asset during his college days. And
really?
Then he was
Wow.
Then he was re-enlisted by the agency when he was in the Marine Corps in Vietnam, and he was supposed to gather intel on the indigenous population. And he had his legend was, and the legend is basically trade wrap for your cover that's supposed to hold until you're able to slip away, was that he was a Canadian national who was running a trading post and doing trade with the natives. And his job was to basically talk to the people. When he asked his handlers what his job was supposed to be, they said, well, you're a nice guy, talk to him. So he talked to VC and NVA guys that would show up. He'd warm up with them, and then they'd tell him what hills their aunts or uncles or cousins or friends, fellow soldiers were located, and then he'd report back to his handlers, and lo and behold, the locations that he reported on ended up being bombed. And he had a really interesting career over there. He met an NVA general and made friends with this, befriended this NVA general, and this general wanted him to go with him to Hanoi. He liked him that much, and he wasn't at all thrilled with the idea, but he ended up saying, well, his agency handlers said, well, you know, this is too good of an opportunity to gather intel to let slip by, so you're going to do it. So he said, okay, and he went over there. It didn't work out too well. He was the only white guy in Hanoi. He didn't feel right. He felt way out of place. It was
a little bit out of place, yeah.
Yeah, too stressful to function correctly. So he came back with very poor intel. They were not pleased with him, and somebody in the agency ended up blowing his cover to kind of get vengeance on him for doing such a poor job, apparently. You know, which tells you just how, you know, common things like the Valerie Plame affair are. It's nothing new. It's been going on for quite some time. And the intel business is really, really dangerous, especially when things get politicized, as they did in his case.
Well, we get a lot of complaints about poor intelligence on our show, too, so we can sort of relate to that.
Yeah, not the stories, like what
from
we're saying.
From our listeners, yeah.
Well, he ended up being in a lot of danger, but his NVA friend got him out of danger. His NVA general friend got him out of danger, and that's why he's alive today. But he ended up teaching me not only about political science issues like constitutional law and criminal justice, but he also basically taught me that deep political practices and conspiracy are a reality. They're just a concept of life. And so that got me looking a lot more, although I really, really didn't get too serious until 2001, because my first great love in life was, and still is, acting in the stage. So I spent most of my time doing plays until the local theater scene started to dry up around 2001, and 9/11 happened, and that's when I actually really took off with this and started to engage the topic on a serious level.
Wow.
Yeah, so this is Philip, and I guess my background is somewhat the same in that I was always very involved in theater and the performing arts, and I've done several plays and played several roles, even did one in a short film that, an independent film that got shelved. But my interest in the topic began to began to really become edified when I started to take communication studies. In fact, that's what one of my majors was in college, was communication studies. And in particular, when you're studying communications, everybody who's studying communications will invariably come across media criticism. And in the subject of media criticism, it's relatively candid that the media is actually somewhat dishonest. Most media critics will show through semiotic analysis, and semiotics, by the way, is just the study of signs, the study of how signs and symbols are used to convey certain messages, to communicate certain themes. But most media critics show through semiotic analysis how through the juxtaposition of images and the accompaniment of certain narratives that the mass media can promulgate specific paradigms that it considers desirable, and meanwhile discourage or dissuade others away from certain modes of thought and behavior that they consider undesirable. So right away, I started to see that the media industry and the entertainment industry was largely devoted to what Noam Chomsky dubbed manufacturing consent, which is inherently conspiratorial. At any rate, in the meantime, I was also heavily immersed in my studies of philosophy. In fact, that's what I got my minor in, was philosophy. And in studying philosophy, I became deeply interested in several subsets of subtopics of philosophy, namely philosophy of mind, and also the philosophy concerning science and religion. And I became very interested in what's known as the sociology of scientific thought, which has been pioneered by thinkers such as Thomas Kuhn and Charles Fort, and basically holds that scientific paradigms are not formulated in a vacuum. Sociological considerations are actually factored into the formulation of scientific paradigms. So I began to see how that related, for instance, to the promulgation of particular scientific theories that certain forms of 20th century totalitarianism were premised on, namely Darwinism. Darwinism acted, of course, as one of the scientific premises for both Hitlerian fascism and communism. And that led me down the trail of seeking out the sociological influences that went into the formulation of Darwin's theory. And in the course of studying that, I came across several esoteric corners that led me to such more obscure esoteric corners like Freemasonry, into some oligarchical corners such as the Huxley dynasty, into eugenical corners such as Herbert Spencer and Harriet Martineau. But all this again led back to kind of a conspiratorial undercurrent, because for many of these groups, namely, for instance, Freemasonry, have had a hand in conspiratorial history. For instance, Freemasonry was very prominent in the Enlightenment and in promulgating Enlightenment ideas, and the Enlightenment had a subversive revolutionary wing that actually led to the French Revolution, which of course was a bloodbath. But at any rate, so that portion of my philosophy studies basically took me on a conspiratorial trajectory. Meanwhile, another philosopher by the name of Michel Foucault, in his book Discipline and Punish, he basically showed how the model of the panopticon, which was developed by Jeremy Bentham, who himself was another Enlightenment thinker, that schema has been diffused throughout the social body, the modern social body, and as a result, the carceral system of prison has become a carceral culture, and most of the schema that comprises the prison system has now been adapted to the civilian milieu. And that really affirmed more Orwellian contentions, the contentions of George Orwell in 1984, who again has something of a conspiratorial background. So eventually, Paul's research and my research, we began to identify certain synchronicities in it, and we just began to synthesize our data, and as a result, we've managed to provide something of a more gestalt in terms of deep politics, parapolitics, and conspiratorial research. Not to belittle the efforts of others, but in essence, what Paul and I attempt to do, Paul brings the political tangibles and historical tangibles to the table, and then I provide readers with a conceptual and philosophical analysis of them.
Okay.
So you have the concretes, and then you have the abstract, and you don't normally find that with a lot of modern conspiratorial research.
Now, are both of you all, when I've seen pictures of you, it looks like you all are pretty close to the same age. Are you all pretty close?
We're twins.
We're twins. Well, that agrees with my assumption here. It did not have anything to do with transhumanism or biological revolution, did it? Because I know we have Dr. Horn on a lot, and I didn't know if you all were like a test case of the master race or something. You may get asked that a lot. I don't know. Now, I also noticed that you all had gotten your first-year associate's degree and then later finished your bachelor's degree work at about the same time. Were these at the same universities at the same time?
Yes, it was.
I know you all took some diverse fields within the liberal arts studies, but basically you were sort of similar on same campuses and things like that.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay.
Essentially, this is Philip. I have a communication studies major and a liberal studies major and a philosophy minor, and Paul had
liberal studies with a political science minor.
Yeah.
And how long have you all been operating outside of, if I can mention, southwestern Ohio, that particular neck of the woods?
Since probably like 95.
Yeah, 95.
We never intended to stay out here this long, but it just happened that way.
Well, that former stomping grounds of Dr. Future was down the road, so there must be something special about that place. I don't like Stonehenge or something. I don't know. It birthed something there. It could be those secret military experiments at Wright Pat. I don't know.
That's why you keep trying to get me to drink that water.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Philip, as I understand it, right, you're a full-time journalist as well, correct?
Yes, as a matter of fact, both of us are.
Both of you.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Yeah, I work as a staff writer for the Vandalia Drummer. Paul is.
Yeah, I'm Enid Messenger, New Carlisle Sun, and I'm also doing some work for Tip City and West Milton papers.
All fine cities up in that area, and I hope we have some listeners from that area. I hope you spread the word. There's a lot of fans of Dr. Future up that way too, and pass on the word that we've got some more favorite sons from that area. If I understand correct, you all took the approach of just doing regular academic, high-level discourse studies, and in going through this information, it became obvious to you, just studying the literature, that what people like to try to characterize and put in a box as conspiracy theories and some of the things we hear talked about on the internet or shows like ours were in fact based by good, sound historical data that provides a lot of credence to things that we'd only heard whispered about before.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And we're trying to elevate it to a level because this is a field that's always strove for some legitimacy, and it just doesn't get the attention or the serious-minded kind of approach that it deserves. And so, we wanted to show that on a level of scholarship that it makes sense and that it's a legitimate, a legitimate field.
And you're giving it the scholarly rigor that would be appropriate and suitable for the subject matter.
Oh, yeah.
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Well, I will give you all a suggestion to consider, having read some of your amazing work, is you might want to find some kindred spirits, if there is such a thing, and start looking at putting some kind of scholarly journal together that's peer-reviewed that would have an opportunity to start in structured form documenting some of these kind of things.
That's a great idea.
Well, actually, we were hoping to do something like that in the not too distant future. Our friend Michael Corbin, who we were primary collaborators with, who basically had the a Closer Look show out of Colorado, he passed away just recently. I'd say, what would it be, a month or two ago?
Yeah, something like 2 months ago.
And we wanted to continue with his journal, his A Closer Look report that he had, the ACL report. And so we're going to try to do something like that, and we talk a little bit with and collaborate a little bit with Indira Singh, who was also on board with Michael as far as the ACL staff was concerned, and they both of them, Michael was and Indira is, about taking that sort of tact and taking that sort of approach to the topic and everything. So yeah, that's what we hope to do eventually here in the not too distant future.
Okay, well that's something that I would certainly be interested in subscribing to, and I'm not sure if I would meet the rigor standards to be able to publish in something like that, but I would certainly like to see what other people do, particularly when they're,
what's going on.
if you get a blue ribbon group to peer review some of these kind of things, and then take some of your findings, maybe hold some conferences, release some press releases on information. You could be providing a wonderful service to your fellow citizens by being able to do that, in a respectable way. I'd like to move on to our discussion for the bulk of our interview, and that's on a topic that might be somewhat mysterious, or people may misunderstand what it is. For the bulk of our audience, typically a traditional evangelical Christian audience that listens to our show, although we certainly have a very diverse group that goes way beyond that, particularly with our internet audience that we have. But this is this mysterious term, Dominionism. And I was wondering if you gentlemen could explain to us and our listeners what this mysterious term is, and can you basically just give us a succinct definition that we can elaborate further on in our discussion regarding this matter?
Sure. Well, basically, dominionism. That term was coined by sociologists. And by the way, I have misgivings with sociology as a field in and of itself, but they do correctly identify the problems with dominionism. Dominionism is basically a variety of pseudo-Christianity that distorts Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. And it basically construes the dominion that God gave man as a purely political dominion. Dominionism basically politicizes the gospel, and it marries Christianity to what could be called the cosmos. Cosmos is the original Greek word for world. That's the word that Jesus used in John chapter 18, verse 36, when he said, "My kingdom is not of this world." In the original Greek, he said, "My kingdom's not of this cosmos." And cosmos connotes an arrangement or a system, an order or government. And so essentially what Jesus was expressing derision with was not the physical world, as some Gnostics would have you believe, but he was expressing derision with the political systems that had come to govern it. And what dominionism does is it actually grafts Christianity onto the cosmos, and as a result, Christianity becomes part and parcel of secular institutions. And the problem with that is once Christianity is wedded to secularism, Christianity will basically adopt all the anthropocentric characteristics of secularism. And one of the anthropocentric premises that pervades secularism and comes to pervade dominionist theology is the notion that man must save himself. And in that sense, it's a form of Gnosticism, because Gnosticism, that's one of its key precepts, that man must save himself. And this becomes evident in the Gnostics, or the Dominionist mandate for man to build the kingdom of God here and now. The kingdom of God was not a kingdom that was, as you know, a kingdom that was to be instantiated by the hand of man. It's a kingdom that was to be instantiated by the hand of God. However, for the Dominionist, the kingdom of God just cannot be instantiated until Christians essentially hold a violent political coup. And so essentially what it does is it pays credence to the anthropocentric premises of secularism that man must save himself. Because after all, if you look at the second coming of Jesus as the final installment in our salvation, then man is facilitating that salvation. And in this sense, Dominionism really isn't genuine Christianity; it's just Gnosticism.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of religious engineering of different groups of the Abrahamic faith has gone on clear across the board with the Christians. The neo-Gnostics are the Dominionists. With the Islamic peoples, the Wahhabists are the neo-Gnostics with their belief that where they actually fiscalize and secularize the sixth pillar of faith, the holy war, and change it from being a spiritual fight to being an actual literal military confrontation. And it even happened, unfortunately, with the world of Judaism, with groups like Jakob Frank of the Frankists, who was a certain strain of Sabbatean Jewish heretical thought that basically held that the Messiah would not come back until people became either thoroughly saints or the environment was thoroughly corrupted and they became thoroughly sinners, one way or the other. But you were going to have to engage in some kind of activism to cause that kind of meeting of the kingdom with earth.
So if I understood you correctly, one could view Dominionism in a Christian sphere as a type of Christian Wahhabism.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Well, that's a provocative term that I'm sure getting a lot of our listeners some pause.
That's very
sure.
When they think about that. I was trying to, and we're going to get into some of the details about the Dominionism in the bulk of our interview here, but I was trying to think of a scriptural analogy, and I know this is very, very simplistic and doesn't really embrace it, but it seemed like to me there's almost a relationship here at the time of Christ's crucifixion, when the religious people, led on by their leadership, and actually were spurred on by them, chose Barabbas, who was a zealot that wanted to overthrow the secular government by force, and they chose him over Jesus, who was speaking about the kingdom of heaven. Is that basically what Dominionists are doing today? Is they're choosing Barabbas over Christ?
That's exactly what they're doing, and in doing so, they're being transformed into a Gnostic sect, which, interestingly, St. John referred to as the spirit of Antichrist in his letters. He said that Gnosticism was the spirit of Antichrist. And if you look back to when the people chose Barabbas over Jesus, the name Barabbas means son of his father. Well, if Jesus Christ was the son of his father and his father was God, then you can only imagine whose son the people were choosing back then. And so,
Wow.
So the Pharisees were just picking one of their brothers because Jesus already said their father was the devil.
Yes, exactly. Wow. So they were choosing the Antichrist back then, and the Dominionists are unwittingly choosing the Antichrist by becoming Gnostics who contain the spirit of Antichrist.
Another good example, some theologians postulate that one of the reasons for Judas's betrayal of Jesus is that Judas was hoping that Jesus was going to instantiate a political regime. And interestingly enough, one of the things that that Jesus did to identify his betrayer, Judas, was he took a piece of bread and he dipped it into sauce, and he said, "Now, whomever I give this to, he will be the traitor." Notice that Jesus earlier used the symbol for his own body. Now he takes the bread, which represents him, and he places it in sauce. He adds something to it. Essentially, and if these theologians are correct about Judas, and that Judas was, in fact, a radical zealot who was hoping that Jesus would turn out to be some sort of political insurrectionist, essentially what Judas was doing was symbolically represented through what Jesus demonstrated. He took the body of Christ, he took the doctrine of Christ, and he added something to it. This is essentially what Dominionism does. It's this ugly concretion where it basically adapts more Jacobin Enlightenment revolutionary features and grafts it onto Christianity, and thus politicizes the gospel and transforms Christianity into what Paul and I call a sect of neo-Gnostic jihadists.
Well, it's very interesting to take those last comments you just made and think about them in light of Chris Pinto's work in the New Atlantis and in Riddles and Stone, and his research on the Enlightenment and the work of those secret societies at that time in the founding of our own country. I find it very consistent with that. But before we go into the details of Dominionism, and I know that you can go into extreme detail, which is great, but I'd like to just, before people misunderstand, you make it very clear in your writings that you are not recommending that Christians completely disengage from society and not care about society issues or not be activists of any kind of form. It's really the nature of how they react to society rather than whether they're involved or engaged or not, correct? And
yeah, absolutely.
So could you share what you understand the Bible says regarding how Christians should relate to societal issues and to civil government?
Yeah, the way that the Bible addresses civil government is best found in the Old Testament with 1 Samuel chapter 8. If you notice the law of Moses, the Ten Commandments made no provision for a king. As a matter of fact, a king can be seen as just a human god, and the first commandment says that you won't have any other gods before me. In 1 Samuel chapter 8, what we find out is that God did not want the nation of Israel. He did not want the Israelites to be ruled by a king. He made no provision for a king in the law of Moses, and he wanted people to be responsible individuals that practice responsibility. But they were fairly insistent on having a king. They looked around at the nations around them and got earthly minded, and wanted to have what everybody else had, which was a monarchy, and it made Samuel angry. And in Samuel chapter 8. Verse 5, they say, "Make us a king to judge us like all the nations." And then verse 7 through 17, God tells Samuel, he says, to paraphrase, don't get upset about this. They're not rejecting you; they're rejecting me. So let them have a king, and here's what that king will be like. That king will basically take their vineyards, their olive yards, the best of them, and give all of that to his servants. And
is that eminent domain? And
yeah,
turning it over to their own corporate backers, basically turning the land over.
Yeah. But he says, well, basically they can have a king and he'll be very authoritarian in nature. But if you'll notice, it was God's original desire for them not to have a king, and that's where America basically is distinct and different from the other nations in the world. That the founding fathers wanted us to return to that model where instead of having a king, people would be responsible individuals and essentially look to a transcendent moral law, an objective transcendent moral law that overarches all governments and all political systems.
Even the deists amongst the founding fathers felt that way.
Yeah, and in this sense, what the founding fathers were instantiating wasn't a theocracy. It was a republic with a theocentric premise. And by theocentric, I mean a God-centered premise. And by God, we're talking about the ultimate principle from which we derive all transcendent moral values. And that's from which we derive the term republic, which is what we have, a constitutional republic. It's res publica. Publica, the public, res thing, the public thing, the law. The law is an objective, transcendent moral law that is derived from an objective, transcendent moral creator.
So our founding fathers actually, rather than being embarrassed by having a minimalist government, they reveled in it. Whereas groups in Europe, I would assume, took great pride in the power and the breadth of the regime of various kingdoms in Europe. In our own country, we reveled the fact that the individual was king, as they reported to God, under the voluntary, non-coercive kingship under God. And our founding fathers had the wisdom to recognize the kingship of God as giving the basis for civil government without getting down into the weeds of details of theology that would just serve to divide the public further.
Absolutely.
As a matter of fact, the whole thing, the whole tradition, the anti-statist, anti-militarist tradition that we find in America started with none other than George Washington, because there were those who wanted to basically give him a title of nobility, and he refused it right there. And so he flatly destroyed any beginning of a statist or militarist tradition for America, and started the foundation off as being actually anti-statist and anti-militarist.
So back to, I'm sorry, I was just going to say, back to our question about how does this relate to how Christians should respond to civil government. Can you give us some details on to-dos that Scripture has, and what some of your thoughts have been on that?
Well, I think it's really simple in that, first off, do not consider politics and do not consider government the source of your salvation. And that's what you find a lot of evangelicals have done. A lot of evangelicals have relocated the source of their salvation within political affiliations, and that's just simply not proportionate with reality. The fact of the matter is that the Republican Party is not Jesus's party. The Republican Party, I mean, you probably heard people have called the GOP God's own party. That's not the case.
That's silliness.
A good many of the principles and a good many of the doctrines that are promoted by the Republican Party are antithetical to Christianity, and that meanwhile it's much the same with the Democrats.
Correct. Right.
So what Christians have to do is they have to divorce themselves from political affiliations and understand that these are not the source of their salvation, and they have to make their decisions in terms of voting and in terms of decisions regarding politics. They have to make them purely based upon biblical precepts and not partisan affiliations.
If Christians make sure that the Constitution is upheld, then they are doing the best thing that they can do, because it's the Constitution that already basically recognizes biblical principles. It's based on the biblical notion of imago viva Dei, the idea that man is created in the image of God. That's already in there, and so if they make sure that the Constitution is upheld, then they are doing what they should do. But when the candidates that cater to them and they begin to start to take on an almost messianic character to them, then you know that they're on a dangerous trajectory. Yeah, you want to avoid partisan affiliations because essentially what you become ensnared in is a Hegelian dialectic. And as anybody who understands Hegelian dialectics can tell you, the polar extremes that constitute a Hegelian dialectic, the thesis and the antithesis, share certain core commonalities which make them capable of being synthesized.
Right.
And so essentially, it becomes a game of pick your poison. Which do you want? Do you want hemlock or strychnine? I guess that the best way to answer the question is take a specific case. For a good case would be homosexual marriage. I think that we can all agree that that's wrong to give that institution over to that particular sect of the population. It's a strictly heterosexual institution, and we'd be going off in the wrong direction. Well, what some people wanted to do was actually create a new amendment to the Constitution that would recognize marriage as being between a man and a woman, and that's the wrong direction to go in, because that's basically saying that the entity known as government has the ability to define and control the institution of marriage, which it has no right to be in that sphere.
Well, let me agree with you 100% on that. That is the same position that I've tried to explain to other believers, is that we diminish the kingdom of God by taking things of God and voluntarily giving them to the state to be an arbiter over. Marriage is so sacred that heaven forbid that the state should get their dirty hands on making these kind of decisions. It only should be defined by the kingdom of God. And we make many of our own problems in the church. When we decide to make something literally a political issue, suddenly then the state has to rule on this based upon a position that's fair to all citizens, including those who don't agree with us, when the whole issue could be avoided entirely by taking institutions such as marriage and keeping it an issue of the church and keeping it out of the state.
Yeah. Well, if Christians want to keep marriage out of the hands of the radical homosexual groups out there, because it's not all homosexuals, it's mostly just these groups, these homosexual groups that actually act almost like revolutionary cells, much the same way that we found in countries that were taken over by like Russia when it fell under the Soviet Union. It's these radical revolutionary homosexual groups that want marriage. The way that we keep it out of their hands is simply by looking to the Constitution and upholding the Constitution. What does the Constitution say? Well, it says that that Congress basically set up these courts, and so Congress has the right to regulate these courts, and they have the right to do away with these courts if they no longer meet the public interest. So these activist judges that are, trying to work to get marriage handed over to the homosexual population, they have the right to regulate them. They have the right to also not only rein them in, but do away with their courts, with the courts of these activist judges if they continue to step out of line. So the mechanism to correcting the problem already exists within the Constitution.
I would give you another example, too. If there are unjust laws that are formed, my understanding through the principle of jury nullification, a jury of peers, citizen peers, can actually declare a law null and void if they determine it to be unjust. Even though they're not allowed to be briefed on it in court. A judge is not allowed to tell them. They have that inherent right. But if they exercise that right as a jury is held, and one of our friends, Robert Hyde, here on the show, has got me started to looking in this area, and I did some reading it, and in fact it's a well-established principle of English law that a jury is considered the highest form of the courts, basically, you could say, in adjudicating, and they have a right to trump that, but our citizenry is not educated enough to understand that these things are at their disposal.
Nope, they haven't read the Constitution or the Bill of Rights any more than they've read the Bible.
Well, if I could summarize something here, so we can move on this, what it sounds like to me is that a Christian trying to get their arms around this and their position as a citizen of the kingdom of heaven, while also an ambassador here on earth, has a situation with civil government where civil government probably is best used when it's considered as a necessary evil for mundane tasks like taking out the garbage and other kind of things that all citizens have an equal stake in making sure that they're addressed. But the minimal amount that you can put, particularly on a federal government, to be able to manage, the more likely everyone else is going to be adequately represented and happy. And, you know, I think about something like a volunteer fire department. You know, you can have the citizens of a community get together and decide it's in their interest for everyone to volunteer to look out for each other's homes. And to me, that's a form of government at its best. When you have a lot of motivated citizens say they have a common stake, whether it's national defense or a local volunteer fire department. As a Christian, I think it is great, and this is just one example I propose, to be involved in something like that, like a volunteer fire department. You don't have to go in there and argue with every fellow fireman on what their religious affiliation is, what their stand is on every doctrinal issue.
You just have to fight the fire.
You are busy going and fighting fires. You have people who are in mortal danger immediately. You can fight the fire. Now, if you decide that if you are the one of the most faithful firefighters, you're one of the most faithful showing up, you risk your lives to save your fellow citizens, your citizens are going to ask you, what's special about you? What is so special that you're willing to do that? And then you have opportunities to minister and to share the gospel to these people after you've earned their respect, and you have already shown that you're looking out for their best interest. I would think when Christians are involved in civil issues or various forms of civil rights or things, once we've shown and earned the trust of people outside the household of faith that we are looking out for their best interest and legitimately care about them and not exploiting them, they are much more open to hear about the good news that we have to share.
Yeah, well, you have to show your faith in action. I believe it was St. Francis of Assisi who said, share the gospel whenever possible, and whenever possible, do so without words.
Right.
Or whenever possible, use words. But essentially, the point being that preaching to people is kind of a useless endeavor. But if they see you tangibly enacting biblical precepts, that gesticulates back towards a genuine faith, a genuine belief, and not just simply another religion. And that's what people need to see. They need to see something that has transformative power in their lives. And they're not going to see that with people attempting to legislate the morality. They're not going to see it. In fact, they'll resent it, and rightfully so. But the reason that people don't have the proper balance between civil government and their faith nowadays is because of illiteracy in two different areas. Illiteracy as far as the Scripture is concerned, and illiteracy as far as the freedom documents go. And you know, that's a reality. They usually leave it up to a pastor or a minister to explain the Scriptures to them, and then they leave it up to a quote-unquote legal expert on Fox News or CNN or wherever to basically tell them what the ins and outs of the Constitution are. You know, it goes back to if you go back to the time of the Kennedy assassination, you know, and you read what the Warren Commission found. They basically you look and you see that in the investigation, you see that Oswald did not, was not guilty. But, you know, it didn't really worry Alan Dulles, who was a major spearhead in that commission. It didn't worry him at all that they did not prove Oswald's guilt. He shrugged it off and said, people don't read. And, you know, so the same principle.
Right.
The same principle applies here entirely.
Well, he'd be shaking in his boots today if he knew Future Quake was on the air. He'd have some second thoughts about that right now. Well, we have talked about some of the ideals And I'm glad that we put that up front so people don't misunderstand us for the remainder of the interview. And one closing thought I have that to me is a biblical example of what you're expressing. You mentioned the time when the people wanted a king. Just before that, during the time of the judges, which is what God had instituted when they entered the Promised Land, you had sort of the ultimate type of libertarian small government environment where basically you had small local tribes that dealt with common everyday matters, and they did not address things from a large federal stake unless a crisis emerged. The Midianites invaded or surrounding tribes, and then they formed an ad hoc group of people who had common stakeholder concerns. They went and addressed the issue in God's power, and then they went back to their homes and their fields. And that seemed to me to be a pattern, at least in the fallen earth that we're in before we have the righteous king that comes. That was the model that God set in the meantime for us to have a very decentralized living environment. He will call us together to meet an immediate threat, and then we disperse again. And they chose to reject that, and they sort of got star-crossed by seeing the ornate robes and the other tribes and surrounding them and their king, and boy, they sure looked good on camera. Why can't we have something like that?
Good on camera.
It's amazing that God says, one of the first things he says, they're going to tax you a lot. God was concerned about taxes. He said they're going to tax you heavily. And you mentioned other things. They're going to conscript your kids. They're going to send them off to fight in foreign wars. Are you sure this is what you want to do? So God very clearly understood what the ramifications of what now is the modern state of what we deal with.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about back on our Dominionism topic here. This really gets down in the weeds a little bit, but this really shows at least some of the depth of what you've done, and I know you can only scratch the surface in your research about how Dominionism philosophy relates to the Enlightenment. You may even need to define the Enlightenment for some of our listeners. The whole concept of Enlightenment regarding Lucifer, and even a little bit of Freemasonry, where that ties in.
Sure. Well, the Enlightenment was basically came out of 30-year wars, and I guess on the most simplest level, it appeared to be a very radical atheistic movement, and basically it redirected society down an atheistic, deistic form of governance. It was an anthropocentric religion because it placed man at the center of all things. It basically held in reverence the Protagorean dictum that man is the measure of all things, and thus man establishes his own moral precepts. But the Enlightenment had some very distinct Gnostic trappings, and those were demonstrable, for instance, in the doctrines of one Condorcet, who was a philosopher and an Enlightenment thinker. He basically believed that utopia was on the horizon, and that indefinite progress, scientific and technological progress, would facilitate a sort of natural salvation where there would be consistent abundance and eventually immortality for mankind. Well, Condorcet's doctrine of natural salvation merely reiterated the Gnostic doctrine of self-salvation. The Enlightenment also shared Gnosticism's veneration of God's chief opponent, the devil. In the Hypostasis of the Archons, which was an ancient Egyptian Gnostic text, the serpent in Eden was caricatured as humanity's benevolent instructor and an incognito savior. Meanwhile, God, Jehovah, was caricatured as the quote-unquote archon of arrogance, who was fettering man with superstition, who was binding man down from real, true knowledge. And true salvation was to be had through gnosis, which was knowing, which was knowledge, which was the basically the cognitive powers of man actually empowered and made the chief facilitator of his own salvation. And you see the Enlightenment's veneration of the devil with the publication of Diderot's Encyclopedia.
I believe it was in 1751, Diderot published the Encyclopedia, which was considered the Bible of the Enlightenment. And in the Encyclopedia, there was a drawing of Lucifer, and also that drawing was accompanied by Masonic symbols of the square and the compass. And it also bore the imprints of Montesquieu, Rousseau, Buffon, Turgot, and Voltaire. And some of those individuals were actually Freemasons. And that's because this veneration for the devil under his original angelic appellation of Lucifer was a actual hallmark of Freemasonry at the time, and several of those individuals were Freemasons. Now, this is what's known as Luciferianism, and it has to be distinguished from your common variety, garden variety of Satanism. The Luciferian does not revere Satan as a literal metaphysical entity. He reveres Lucifer as a symbol for the cognitive powers of man and man's ability to achieve apotheosis, that is, to become God. And this was a belief that was very much prevalent within the Freemasonic Lodge at the time. And it eventually, it made its way, it was disseminated from the from the halls of Freemasonry on the popular level.
Can I ask you something on this?
Sure.
You mentioned, and that's an important point you make, that they saw Lucifer as symbolic, if man could do becoming God. Do they refer to that based upon Lucifer's claim in Scripture when he says, I will ascend upon the holy mountain, I will be like the Most High God, and they take that goal and place it upon man, that they take Lucifer's goal upon himself?
Yeah, essentially what they did was they reconceptualized Lucifer, the devil, as instead of as an object of faith, as a spiritual entity, as purely an object of immanent experience. And by immanent, I'm invoking that term from the Latin term immanere, which means to remain within. To remain within what? Remain within the ontological confines of the physical universe. So Lucifer becomes a purely physical force, a purely immanent force, channeling itself through man. And essentially, it represents man's abilities to achieve apotheosis through his own reason. And reason, they spelled reason with a capital R because they virtually deified it, because reason is the province of the human mind, and the human mind is the facilitator of man's salvation. And again, this all finds its origins with Gnosticism, the Gnostic concept of self-salvation, and also the Gnostic veneration of the devil, of God's chief adversary. And like the Gnostics, the Enlightenment thinkers absolutely derided, despised Jehovah God. Now, they of course claimed that he did not exist, or that if there were a God, it was a purely immanent God, an impersonal architect of a great architect of the universe that was embodied within nature, much the same way that God was caricatured by Spinoza. And again, this is a purely Gnostic view of God as well, because essentially the Gnostics were never quite satisfied with what's known as cognitio fidei, that is the cognition of faith. They wanted to draw the transcendent within the firmer grip of man, within the existence of man, and so they relocated and transplanted these transcendent concepts within the ontological confines of the physical universe. See, this is how it relates to Dominionism, because Dominionism does much the same thing with the kingdom of God. The Dominionist mandate to basically build the kingdom of God here and now, and man embodies the march of God here on earth. That's essentially what's known as immanentizing the eschaton. That's a term that was invoked first by Eric Voegelin. That's where you take the eschaton, the end of days, and you reconceptualize it as a purely immanent event, it's completely devoid of all its spiritual qualities. It now becomes something that is purely instantiated within the ontological confines of the physical universe, and there is no transcendent reality to it. And that's how Dominionism relates to the Enlightenment, is these Gnostic, this continuity of Gnostic thought between the two.
Well, we're going to talk later about some figures, even well-known figures within evangelical Christianity that have been connected to Dominionism. Sometimes they don't like that term, but they really stand for the principles. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure many of them would be extremely embarrassed to have people know that there is a connection to Gnosticism that really explains the overarching principles.
I would bet they haven't even bothered to, to consider those sort of connections.
Of course, they may think the same thing as Dulles and say that Christians don't read either.
Yeah,
and
that may be true.
Heaven forbid that unfortunately may be true. So basically, it's like you say, an anthropocentric or man-centered belief system that it relies on us, and in fact, it can be rationalized as being very, very virtuous. That we have a sense and a call and a duty to bring these things about, and people can take Bible verses and things like that and try to put together a theology to justify the requirement for our striving to bring about the kingdom of heaven here on earth. And I would tend to think that there are earlier embodiments, not only just within evangelicals who I pick on, even within Catholicism and other groups, that this would have some relationship to things like amillennialism and other things like that, whether it's the church universal and triumphant or individuals, one way or the other trying to bring the kingdom of God here on earth, either to run it ourselves or to hand the keys over to Jesus when he shows up.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, well, again, like I said earlier on, you find this kind of stream of thought in all of the Abrahamic faiths. With the Judaism, unfortunately, you had the Sabbateans, who in one of the Sabbatean sects known as the Frankists, who were followers of Jakob Frank, who basically said the Messiah is not coming back until we take upon ourselves some kind of activism, and we either make the world completely saintly or completely corrupt, one or the two. But that's the only way that we'll see the Messiah return. And as a result, we see this subversion on the part of this particular sect of Judaism, and a lot of intersections between them and the Jacobins, who were Illuminist bred, and who basically were the more violent sect of the revolutionaries, the most violent sect of revolutionaries in France. And so we have that same kind of trend throughout history, and when you have that kind of pattern over and over again, it's suggestive that there has been basically a plan, a script followed by the power elite to turn religions to empty them of all their substance and to make them vehicles for an economic or a social or political or all three agenda of some sort.
Well, it's very interesting when you use this comparison of talking about the Enlightenment and the role of the Jacobins in the French Revolution, in being basically an expression of Dominionism in that context, and it makes me really pause when I think about well-meaning evangelical Christians who've been pulled into Dominionism and what will happen then. Because of Jacobinism and what happened in the French Revolution is any pattern for the future, what little I know in my studies of that revolution, I see a pattern that's the most clear-cut of what we see as the last days Antichrist reign that I know of any historical, because when you look at just the few things, the major things we know in our history books, they changed the times and the seasons. They tried to take religious context out of any kind of holiday celebration. They changed the calendars. They even changed the days of the week.
It sounds very much almost like the Pharisees.
They
that
killed.
sounds like you could
yeah.
be describing the Pharisees.
They killed the religious leaders. They hauled them out, killed them first. They set up their own god that they can control. I believe her name was Liberty? Was that the goddess Liberty?
I think it was Athena.
Okay, but they would refer to her by various names like Liberty, but basically it was that embodiment. Mm-hmm. So they did all these things that we see are prophesied of the last days world government, and it was done under the Jacobins, under this reign of Dominionism, of which some of our religious people may be unwittingly assisting them with.
Well, if you look back to the anarchist Prince Kropotkin back in 1908, he said that the French Revolution was the source and origin of all the communist, anarchist, and socialist conceptions, and that what modern socialism and what the revolutionary movement of the modern time had done was just systematize those ideas and found arguments in their favor. And if you look at Goebbels, the infamous Nazi, he praised the French Revolution, and Hitler saw the Nazi revolt as, in his own words, the counterpart of the French Revolution. So, I mean, that was the model established for that's been followed and recycled again and again right up to the present day with our power elite. That's exactly the same model that they follow.
Essentially, all that Dominionism is it's a Jacobinism given a theistic gloss. And interestingly enough, many Dominionists have aligned themselves with none other than the neoconservatives, who several individuals have identified as direct ideological heirs of the Jacobins. There is an excellent book by Kleist G. Rintz called America the Virtuous, where he basically shows the parallels between neoconservatism and Jacobinism. Of course, Lawrence Wilkerson, who helped, I believe it was Colin Powell, assemble the highly politicized dossier on Iraq, later on said, when he was asked about the neoconservatives, he said, well, they're not conservatives. They're not new conservatives. They're basically Jacobins. They're
the inheritors of Maximilien Robespierre's tradition.
Yeah, and so essentially when the Dominionists align themselves with individuals like the neoconservatives, then they are basically marrying Christianity to the Enlightenment tradition, and to the violent revolutionary wing of the Enlightenment, Jacobinism.
Now, wasn't this alluded to? Not completely, and in fact, I haven't read the book yet. I just got it, "Fire in the Hearts of Men" by our current.
You got that?
I got it by our current.
Oh, you better read it quick because I want to read it.
Our current Librarian of Congress, who actually alludes to these, well, he calls them occult societies in Western Europe that actually formed the foundation alongside the Enlightenment of even the founding of our country. But he admits these very, very same things in the book, and it's very interesting that a lot of his phraseology is quoted verbatim in speeches by George W. Bush.
Absolutely, exactly. "Fire in the Minds of Men" by James Billington. And we've heard the president actually use the term "fire in the minds of men." Not that he himself probably knows what that means. I see him by and large just merely a figurehead, and that's the way it works in the deep political world. Is that presidents and heads of states are really nothing more than branch managers, and it's somebody else that's basically guiding things behind the scenes.
The handlers take it, and that's not just a dish against Bush. That's true for most of the presidents, correct?
Right, absolutely.
Right, right.
But he used the term "fire in the minds of men," and I don't think he knows or can appreciate what that
Which
term
is a conspicuous allusion to Dostoevsky's, what Dostoevsky calls the revolutionary faith of the socialist revolutionaries of that time, and that's essentially what you see being mobilized through the Bush administration, through this presidency. You see kind of this radical, violent socialist revolutionary movement under the guise of the
Neoconservative.
Yeah, the neoconservative.
Now,
Don't
most
they
people
call it
won't-
spreading democracy? Isn't that the
Yeah, the
term used?
Global Democratic Revolution, which is essentially just Trotsky's Fourth International.
And most people don't recognize this because they have come to see a lot of the neoconservative movers and shakers as anti-communist, but it would be wrong to characterize them as anti-communist. They're more properly anti-Stalinist. Is
Okay.
what they. I mean, they were Trotskyists who basically thought that the Soviet Union was abandoning the cause of communism, and so so the Cold War became for them basically a love spat between the Trotskyites and the Stalin and the Stalinist variety of communism.
Wow. Well, I want to move on to another topic. Our time's getting away, but I want to talk about something that gets closer to some of your other core writings that you've done, and that's defining some additional terms for our listeners to chew on. They've certainly had not nearly enough deep topics or concepts already, so
Yeah.
we'll lay some more on them.
Enough softball, guys.
Yeah. the concepts of scientism and technocracy. Can you explain what they are and how they relate to these movements, and how does it handle concepts like human liberty and dignity?
Sure. Well, basically, scientism is the fetishization of science. It holds that science should be ecumenically imposed upon all fields of inquiry. And while the modern mind, chronocentric as it is, might consider such an imposition desirable, the truth of the matter is that science as a system of quantification, because that's fundamentally what it is, it deals predominantly with systems of measurement. As a system of quantification, it can only concern itself with quantifiable entities. Thus, whatever cannot be quantified must be jettisoned, must be precluded from purely scientific considerations. And that means that concepts such as human liberty, dignity, the sanctity of life, and of course God, a transcendent spiritual reality, all these things must be jettisoned. Now, scientism, one of the areas that scientism holds should see the ecumenical imposition of science upon is none other than the areas of political science and governance. And when you basically have the scientifically arranged state, which Aldous Huxley called the scientific dictatorship, basically what you have is a technocracy, and the technocracy is a rule by a cognitive elite, a rule by those who rule according to, by virtue of their specialized knowledge, policy professionals, individuals who simply have the cognitive capacity that you and I and all the other vulgar, unwashed commoners do not have. And so they, by virtue of their specialized knowledge, must rule. Now,
Wait a second. I have a PhD in science. Could I be one of the ruling elite, or am I stuck down with the rest of the unwashed?
Just so long as you do not deviate from the status quo, just so long as you subscribe to whatever all the other so-called specialists and policy professionals subscribe to. If you had a problem, for instance, with, say, evolution, well, you couldn't take part in this government because they view evolution on an ecumenical level, on a universal level. They view all forms of governance as a corresponding political evolution to our alleged biological evolution. And if you subscribe to certain other scientific paradigms that make room, say, for a certain theistic worldview, say Christianity, well, evidently you probably wouldn't have much of a place because in this sort of government, because you're deviating from the status quo, the scientific status quo.
So even though they are science background, they may revere in words the scientific method, but they also revere even more so political correctness in their own paradigm. And even though I may say they don't have all of the data to take something from a hypothesis to theory to law, they add the political component to it where they move directly to the law and squash any kind of dissenting scientific approach, which is actually counter to the classic scientific method.
Absolutely. That is absolutely true. And as a result, you have kind of this tyranny of institutionally accredited science. And it becomes kind of its own theocracy because scientists merely become priests who don lab coats and act as the chief expositors of miracles, signs, and wonders, a la test tubes and beakers. And the scientific jargon of the day becomes an esoteric vernacular that is basically chanted off almost like hymns and like vespers, and all the rest of the unwashed, vulgar masses just cannot apprehend these things, and so they must be kept low. They must be governed, and that's essentially what technocracy is, and that was what the Enlightenment was attempting to achieve, was a technocratic form of governance or scientific dictatorship.
Was the whole idea of the bureaucracy part of the outgrowth of technocracy?
Absolutely. Bureaucracy is integral to technocracy. Vast compartmentalization, very much integral to the concept of technocracy. Because essentially through compartmentalization, you have a way of diffusing power enough so as to basically nullify any grassroots efforts to dethrone the technocratic elite.
We see they do know about inertia, the concepts, and they know if they put enough ballast, bureaucratic ballast, that should stop any kind of uprisings of truth that might come against
Absolutely.
it.
Absolutely.
Well, this is a bitter pill for me to swallow. I have to explain to you, because I have been one to be a proponent for particularly young Christians getting involved in the sciences. I did not go into biological sciences, so I didn't have the issues to face with professors about evolution and about some of these other issues. The engineering field is relatively straightforward. In fact, I even found nestled in some thermodynamics text and engineering some admission that things like the second laws of thermodynamics are basically concessions about a creator in the universe.
Right.
Really?
Tucked in some secular textbooks at a secular university. But I have tried to encourage more young people to go into these fields simply because there are people who are not being reached within technical environments in other similar professions that are not hearing the gospel, and they need to be reached by people. And I find a lot of our Christian universities are just simply choosing not to offer subject areas. There's only maybe 2, at most 3 Christian universities in the country I know that even offer an engineering program.
Really?
And it's almost like they've thrown their hands up and said there's no way we can reach these people. But what it sounds like to me is they need to get in the middle of the fray and fight these things out. What you explained here is not just an abstract philosophical concept. I see it working regularly, and any other scientist-type person would agree with me on this. When it comes to the point of trying to get government grants or other kind of grant money, you find somewhat there's technical principles that are used to evaluate ideas, concepts, and proposals, but political correctness, even within the technical community, always trumps other factors and considerations in being able to get money for universities or for other researchers to do work. And they always have a cause du jour that's been politically approved by those above, and then the scientists will factor rationale after the fact to justify that. So that's how I see your premise actually working today, even within investments that are made within the research community.
Absolutely. And just a little disclaimer, by scientism, I'm not referring to legitimate science, which has a place in the study of natural phenomena. I am basically dissuading people from the fetishization of science, and just understanding that science has its own proper place within a hierarchy of knowledge, and that science in and of itself cannot represent the sum totality of reality. Science deals with quantifiable entities, deals with what is empirically verifiable, but because science cannot deal with suprasensible entities, cannot deal with considerations that are outside empirical analysis, science cannot be considered the ultimate and only measuring stick for defining reality, and that's what those of the scientific paradigm do. They basically believe that science is the universal expositor of truth, and as such can be just used in questions of ethics, of morality, and of governance in the political science. And as a result, that's where we have the majority of totalitarian regimes of the 20th century coming from today. The Marxist variety of socialism was referred to by Frederick Engels as scientific socialism, mainly because it was based on the scientific premises of empiricism, which is the epistemological position that all knowledge is derived exclusively from the senses, and thus while all suprasensible phenomena and suprasensible entities were completely precluded from Marxism, namely God, namely the human spirit, and dignity and liberty. All these things that were not quantifiable entities were completely precluded, and that's the pitfall of scientism. Scientism basically reduces man to nothing more than a soulless meat machine.
Well, it also reduces their capability to be good scientists. Some of the most famous scientists that have contributed most to their field had a relationship with God. I'm thinking about Newton, Blaise Pascal, a number of other famous people. Most of those
them wrote a lot about God.
Most of those gentlemen, their primary pursuit was the pursuit of the nature of God. And as a subset of that, they looked into science to find further elaborations to help their understanding of who God was. And that's the proper relationship of things, and that's what's been cut off. And what's interesting, an example you give with the Soviet Union, is by divorcing themselves of the revelatory opportunities through a relationship with a creator God, that limited their capability to benefit and bless their own people. That cut off the capability for God's blessing to even work within their own brilliant people, and the Russian people are just brilliant, but they were severely handicapped when they were given or taken away that the spiritual component of their lives to be able to see that illumination from God.
But if you'll notice, it also made it quite easy for individuals like Joseph Stalin and V.I. Lenin to become, within their own little world, gods unto themselves. That's why it comes, again, this all goes back to the Enlightenment tradition, which in turn comes out of Gnostic thinking. The idea is the enthronement of man, the apotheosis of man, basically to divorce man from the Creator so that man becomes his own God. And that's essentially what atheism is. Atheism is not so much the rejection of God as it is a segue, a philosophical segue for the supplanting of God by man. Because as Malcolm Muggeridge himself, who used to be an atheist, said, when you get rid of God, somebody has to take his place. And invariably, who is that? Invariably, it's man himself.
It's interesting, though, that you point out that that it actually led to a retardation of progress.
Right.
When it in the Soviet Union, when it was supposed to be. When it was supposed to bring about progress, that there was supposed to, that's the nobody understood and appreciated this more than the power elite here in the United States, and that's why we see several leading lights within the power elite actually funding the Bolsheviks. Primary amongst those funding the Bolsheviks was none other than Rockefeller, because he knew that it would retard technological and scientific progress over in Russia. It would retard industrial progress, and that's what he wanted at the time, because the Tsar was a very repressive ruler, and nobody's going to argue that here. But the truth of the matter is that he was heading them in a direction where they were about to be on par with the United States, and thus on par with the Western faction of the elite. When the Bolsheviks came to power, all those oil fields just sat idle. They were neglected all of a sudden, and half of those oil wells weren't even touched, and industry slowed to a crawl until Rockefeller and some of his capitalist friends could
Arm and
actually
Hammer.
get in there.
Yeah, Arm and Hammer.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he knew how to hamstring them basically for his own purposes.
Right.
Well, I find what's interesting is that when we see their documents in hindsight in the last days of the Soviet Union, they were able to basically grudgingly admit their shortcomings, because then they started investing in all sorts of bizarre spiritual things like psychics and other kind of things that we find where they almost admitted the failure of their whole system, in that they did that route, but it was in a real Mickey Mouse fashion. Rather than looking on revealed truth, developed over millennia between God and man, they start doing these kind of things. We need to wrap up. We're coming up to the end, and I'm afraid our listeners are going to be left with a cliffhanger, because I wanted to promise them that we were going to start talking about some specific names and movements today with this, but there's just simply too much material here.
Going to have to keep that for a different show, I think.
And I want to know if you would be willing to come back later this summer and take on part 2 of our discussion.
Yeah, this is
Sure.
This is
Absolutely.
too good to leave to one discussion.
Well, I've decided that I would rather you give these kind of subjects the treatment they deserve, rather than trying to rush them through and say we completed something. So if you don't mind, I'd like to have you back. But you're bringing your discussion of scientism and technocracy obviously must touch on the book that you have written called The Ascendancy of the Scientific Dictatorship. In about a minute, could you just give us a quick understanding of the premise and where our listeners can get that book and find your other writings?
Yeah, sure. Well, basically, the overall premise of the ascendancy of the scientific dictatorship is that the older theocratic power structures of antiquity, namely those in Mesopotamia 6,000 years ago, and Babylon and Egypt, found a source of continuity in the technocratic forms of governance in the 20th century and going into the 21st century with communism, with fascism, and now with the synthesis of all forms of socialism and capitalism in the West and what we see in the emergent New World Order today. People who are interested in picking up a copy can do so just by visiting Amazon.com. You want the 2006 Book Surge edition. You do not want the 2003 iUniverse edition, because the 2006 Book Surge edition is the one with the most updated and extensive information.
Okay. And I'm certainly a breezy read they can probably get through in an afternoon.
Yeah.
I challenge anyone to get
Danielle
through
Steele book or something.
to get through one of your articles in more than a week. Thank you so much for being with
you guys
us.
were great.
We'd like to have you back regularly. I think this is a gang of four that really works here.
Yeah.
I agree.
Much more than for the Chinese. Our audience, they had their gang of four. It didn't turn out so well. So we'd love to have you back again. Times are a-changing. We've got big things happening all around us, and you two are just the kind of guys that can all put it in proper perspective for us and help educate us on a background and explain what we're seeing right now. I know our listeners appreciate you and what you're doing. I wholeheartedly encourage everyone to get your book, but we're going to have to say goodbye to now. But I just want to thank you so much for joining us, and we're going to hold you on your word to come back here again in another
you guys are on the hook
another
now.
month or two, okay?
Sounds good. Yeah, we'll definitely do. We'll have to talk about the CMP next time and start naming some names, if you know what I mean.
Oh, I'm gonna. We're out a hole in the carpet here, pacing back and forth. Wait a minute, ladies and gentlemen, you're in for a treat. I didn't mean to leave it to cliffhanger, but this is some essential education that the Collins brothers are giving us here.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to having you back again very, very soon.
Outstanding. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you again. We'll talk to you soon.
Yeah. Bye-bye.